Good afternoon and good morning for those in Southeast Asia. And welcome to our SEAMEO-AUS EduLink webinar series. And this is our first webinar. Today, we're going to unpack the topic is how we use feedback in ePortfolios. And today we have two experts in the ePortfolio from the University of Queensland, Associate Professor Christine Slade and Shari Bowler, and both of them are working at the what we call Institute of Teaching and Learning Innovation, or ITALI for short. So before we go further, I would like to give a brief of today's session. So we're going to talk about technical stuff, technical support, and then we're going to continue to the workshop. And then throughout the workshop, I think we will have opportunities to join the conversation or to ask the questions. And we're also going to have the Q&A session at the end as well. And then we're going to have conclusion sessions, and as well as point out what's going to happen next, right? So let's talk about the technical stuff. And please register your attendance. I'm going to put in the link to the registration so that we can issue your certificate. And if you have technical issue, please ask or put your issue or questions in the chat. Mostly, and I'm going to monitoring the chat. And this session will be recorded, and we will post it on our website. So after that, you can access to the recordings, as well as you can make the comments so we can keep our conversation going. We would like to have these sessions at the starting point, not the end point. So welcome for the comments later on. And during the workshop, please mute yourself. And if you would like to speak, please raise your hand and where appropriate. And then don't forget to unmute yourself before speaking. And if you have questions, I think, are you going to take the questions during the talk, or?
So what's going to happen is we'll tell you in a few minutes a bit more detail, but we've got 3 sections, but there'll be 2 question and answer sessions, one halfway through and one at the end. So that's probably the key place where people could either store their questions to ask then, so as a group, or they could put something in the chat, but we may not be able to answer that on the way through. So if you would like to perhaps monitor some of those in case you see some and we've missed it,
yes.
That would be good. Yeah, but we have 2 special sections where we can ask questions and answers.
Yes, perfect. Happy to do that. And then at the end, we're going to have the post survey, and there will be only 10 questions, short questions. We would like to use the information, your opinions, to prepare for the next workshops. We would like you to have as present experience as possible. And then the resources, like including the readings, PowerPoint, or workshop recording will be uploaded later, maybe next week or toward the end of this week. And then please join us the conversations at the community website. And before we go further, I would like to introduce our guest speakers. Today we have Associate Professor Christine Slade. She is an academic at ITALI, UQ, and with leadership responsibility in assessment. And Christine is the active advisor for ePortfolio implementation, focusing on pedagogical outcomes for students and practical research outcomes. And Shari is an experienced learning designer, and her focus on portfolio pedagogies fosters assessment design for student-driven learning and feedback uptake to encourage the development of reflective and self-regulated learning. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Shari, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nan.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm going to stop share.
Okay, I will share my screen. Here. And there we go. Thank you for the introductions, and I'll hand over to Christine to kick us off.
Yes, thanks, Shari and Nan. So welcome, everybody. We just talked briefly about some of the question and answer times, but this is a more detailed workshop run sheet. So what we'll be doing. So we have planned an activity just to get to know each other a bit more, because we're mindful also that you come from different countries as well and may not know everyone. And then I'll talk for a little while about some of the theory, but information about using ePortfolios, because we're mindful that you use that for your own professional development, but also you're developing projects for your teaching. And then we'll have thinking about feedback in the same sort of way. What is feedback? How do we use it, etc. In that time, and interspersed between both Shari and my part, we will actually have just a quick poll. So if you use Zoom at all, you'll know that there's a poll function, and it will just, Shari will lead us through that, but it will just come up hopefully on your screen, and you'll be able to sort of click answers. So that's trying to get a bit of interaction between us all while we go along. Then after the feedback session, we will have a short Q&A, so question and answers about what I've been talking about. And then I'll hand over to Shari, and she'll give you the more practical application. So Shari is the learning designer ePortfolios at UQ, and she's very talented and experienced at giving pedagogical solutions, I guess, for people on how to use feedback, just as one example. So she'll talk and show you actually some of the things that she's used that you might be able to take away for your practice as well. And then we just have another poll about that and another larger question and answer time and wrap up. So that's where we're heading. Thanks, Shari. So our learning outcomes for this workshop, we have 4 of those. So we hope at the end of the workshop, you will be able to envisage how to use ePortfolios in your context. So what would that look like? We don't know all the contexts that you have, but we're hoping we can give you some starters and some principles and practice that might help you to actually use more effectively ePortfolios in your teaching. We want you to be able to think differently about the timing of feedback. So Shari will talk quite a lot about what does that look like, the different styles of feedback that we currently give and what we're trying to achieve. And similarly, we want to think about maybe some expansion of the roles of feedback processes. So how can we make better use of those processes? And of course, we would like you to think about one or more, but one at least, new feedback strategy you could add into your ePortfolio curriculum plan. So that project that you're developing for your students, let's think about ways you could improve and put in feedback strategies. Thank you.
Sorry. One second.
I say or not?
There we go.
Go.
Okay, great. So first we're going to do an activity in a Padlet. We'd like to know where you live. So you can either do this on your phone by scanning that QR code, or I'm going to put this link in the chat right now, and then you can open this up on your screen. So here's the link there, and I'll give you a few seconds here to jump in, and this should open up to a Padlet showing a map, and I'm going to go there as well in a second. Has everybody had a chance to go in?
Yes.
So I've opened it on my phone, Shari, but it's still opening up. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm going to switch views, and I'll open this up here. Okay, I'll show you how to do this. So it should open up to here. Oh, I see somebody's very clever and has already managed this. So using this plus symbol over here, which turns into a pencil, you can add, if you click there and add a post, You can either click and drag this option here to anywhere on the map, or you can search for a place by the name. So I might put in Brisbane, or I might put the University of Queensland. So I'm going to start typing in University of Queensland. There we are. And then you're going to have this window open up. I'd like you to type your name in there so we see who you are and where you're joining us today. Christine, I'll put you in here as well. I know that you're not here on campus with me today. And then you click publish and it'll come up with a little pin. And you can, using the hand, you can click and drag around, you can zoom in and out. So Christine and I are all the way over here, and Nan as well are all the way over here in Brisbane, Australia. And I can see we've got lots of people over here. So we've got Philippines. Zoom in. Now, I have never been to this part of the world myself at all. Christine, have you?
I've been to the Philippines, yes.
Very good. Give everybody a couple minutes.
So let's just know if you've got any troubles. We'll see if we can help you, because it's quite a good, you can do different activities in Padlet with your students as well. So it's a good tool.
Yeah, to promote some engagement and conversations. And you could do one where have you traveled with your students? Where would you like to travel one day when we can all travel a bit more? Look at this. So we're very spread apart here. Anywhere else? Let me just zoom out and see if we've got anybody else not showing on this map. Catch any outliers? Nope. That's it. Very good. Oh, there's a beautiful photo. Great. Thank you so much for doing that. Must be nice for us to refer back to and get some context where everybody joined us from. Okay, shall I keep going?
Yeah.
Great.
If you want to have a go at still doing that, just keep going.
Keep working away.
We can come back to it later, yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, back to you, Christine.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the first section. That's okay. This is the first section that we're going to look at is ePortfolios. So what, and I recognize that you probably have different levels of understanding about ePortfolios. So we've thrown in a bit of different levels here. So what, obviously we appreciate that you have different contexts, and what do we actually mean by an ePortfolio, and what can you use it for, and what do you really need to know to use it? Thanks. So Shari and I are aware that you all come from different contexts. So just as we see not only geographical context there, but you are thinking about or already using ePortfolios in different contexts yourself. So we're mindful that as a teacher, you are currently a part of a community of practice that you're sharing with each other about reflections of practice and maybe peer reviewing each other's reflections. So you've got that kind of work works very well in ePortfolios. But then I know that you're teachers as well. So over here, we would call that, like the older children would be high school and then down to primary and infants. And there may be even other areas which you're actually having a dual role or more in using ePortfolios. So I guess the key thing I want to say about that is really that when I'm talking, the principles of using ePortfolios or the things that I'm saying around them are the same no matter what, but they will need to be contextualized to the age of your students or the different needs that they have, all for yourself. So just be mindful. You need to be thinking in the back of your head, oh, yes, that's great. I could use this, for example, in this way or not. Thanks, Shari. So what is an ePortfolio? So this is the JISC version, which is used quite commonly. And the interesting part about this is that ePortfolios are a product. So you'll see, for example, or you might have your students creating something. So a learner is creating a product. It could also be a collection. So as the repository of artifacts, we are storing them as products ready to be used. Or it could be experiences, achievements, or learning. So quite a large scope of things that are products involved in ePortfolios. But perhaps the thing that makes it different to other digital tools is the fact that the creator of the ePortfolio has to go through quite a number of rich and complex processes involved in either getting those products or using the products. So one is they have to plan maybe what they're going to choose to put in their ePortfolio, or when they're actually showcasing, they have to plan what to use. So synthesizing, I'm going to decide to use these particular things in this particular audience or whatever. So there's a lot of the synthesis of materials that goes into using an ePortfolio. And then there's the sharing quality. So sharing in groups or sharing to a potential employer or a potential audience of some kind, maybe a presentation to the teacher is involved. And then it's a social kind of thing. So discussing something, you have to write something, a reflection, or there's involvement. You have to be active in these processes. And the one that we're really looking at today is giving, receiving, and responding to feedback. So obviously we have the learner or the creator doing these things, but a very important part of that role is the feedback they get on that. So the processes returned here are really ePortfolio-based learning, which is the focus of increasing attention, because the process of learning can be as important as the end product. So that's probably the first principle. It's not just about racing through to get an end product. It's what the person who is doing the ePortfolio is learning through doing all of these tasks and these thinking skills, etc. That's just as important as the product they make. Thanks, Shari. So Shari and I had quite a bit of a discussion about this one. What sort of uses can you use? You know, what's appropriate for our ePortfolio pedagogy? What would you use it for? And obviously there's a few that come up very quickly that are used quite commonly. For example, reflection. So some classes, some decisions are made quite frequently around using it for reflection. And it's very good for that because you can actually put in there scaffolded activities. You can design learning activities, so students have to think critically about what they've done. So there's definitely a lot of scope for reflection in ePortfolios. And similarly, assessment. So both formative and summative assessment, you can help students learn a skill and then test them on how much they know. So assessment is a common use of ePortfolios. One that probably is a little bit more a softer skill would be self-regulation. So the idea that a student has to, or yourself, the creator has to think about what they're going to choose to do. It's a very individual thing. So they have to regulate their own learning. They have to make decisions about what would be best for them. They might learn about their strengths and weaknesses. So there's a lot of personal development going on with using ePortfolios. There might be group work, so social learning, what we call working in teams, working in pairs. You can design collaborative activities. Teaching higher order thinking. So that's part of the processes I was just talking about. How to communicate effectively, how to make judgments, how to demonstrate competency. We want the students to be critical thinkers and have these skills that they'll need for lifelong learning. And then for yourselves, your in-service teaching, professional development. So you have to keep learning as you go. And an ePortfolio is actually a very effective way of storing your own artifacts or information or reflections on experiences and that you want to use as part of maybe what you have to show to somebody about your teaching experience or getting a new job or even your own personal reflection on practice. So there's that role as well. And we will be talking more about that, Christine Brown-Wilson and I, in the workshop about professional development. Employability, I've touched a bit on that, but again, for students, high school students, for example, they might need to work on where they're going next after high school, even a part-time job they might have while they're at school. But the idea is that they're learning about what skills and competencies and knowledge I have to be an employee. And that links in with showcase. So you'll see that's quite common in ePortfolios. How can I show people of a certain audience who I am and why I would be good at doing something? And then for us, curating feedback. So we're going to suggest to you today that students can be more active in feedback and they can also reflect on that feedback. So we want them to be able to store it over time so they know where to get it and how to work with it. Thanks, Shari.
All right, so that brings us to our first poll. So I'm going to open it up here and it should appear on your screen. And the question for this one is, how do you plan to use your portfolios, or why, how do you, out of everything Christine just talked about, how do you think you would do this in your context? There's some options there: reflective practice, group work, formative summative assessments, maybe just a repository as well, somewhere for students to store things. Perhaps in higher education, they're evidencing professional competencies in the area of healthcare professions, or perhaps, again, for employability around that, a showcase option. So give a few seconds there to vote. Let's see, it's balanced. It was a bit balanced there for a minute. I'm going to share the results with you in a second. Give you a few more seconds. I've got 20 people in, 22 people. When I share the results, be interesting what you think. Okay, I'm going to, oh, another one. 5 seconds. Okay. Hopefully now you can see the results. Is that right? Can you see those on your screen? Christine, can you see the results?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So we've got, it looks like the clear winners are around reflective practice, assessments, and evidencing professional competencies, which isn't really a surprise. You know, the underpinning of ePortfolio practice, like Christine said, is really that reflective practice and that student-driven assessment process. So yeah, great. And some showcasing, lots of personal web pages coming in as well. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And I'll keep going. Back to you, Christine.
Right, so I think this is the last one in this section, and perhaps it's a bit more conceptual, but there's a fantastic paper which we will share with you in the bundle of resources we're giving NAN, probably to put up on your community of practice site. But the one by Lynn Lewis, 2017, talks about threshold concepts in ePortfolios. Now, from my discipline background, I'm used to the idea of threshold concepts. You may or may not be, but really the idea of it is that these are concepts that you must understand to be able to, for example, be an engineer or an accountant or whatever. So they're like taking on the persona of that discipline. And Lynn explains that very well in this paper. So when people use ePortfolios, or you want to use them in curriculum, there are certain things, I think, to really understand them enough that you need to really grab hold of and take with you. Now, if you look at number one, you know, the purpose of the ePortfolio for learning needs to be clear and explicit. You would say that for every piece of curriculum. But I think the tendency is, and we're only talking about ePortfolios here, but it could be other ideas, is that you can wander or you can just get off skew with it. So you really need to be clear about why you want to use an ePortfolio. So that's not only for you, but that's for the students, because you need to enforce to the students the reason why they're using it, especially in the early stages, is they're finding whatever you've given them to do a bit hard to get a handle of. Like if the technology is a bit tricky for them, they might need to be encouraged by you externally to keep going. So you need to be very clear so you can explain that to them as well. Number 2 is the constructivism concept. So constructivists believe that a person will learn in their own way. So it's an individual experience. And that's very true for ePortfolios. So each person that's creating an ePortfolio will have different experience of actually creating the ePortfolio and also what they're going to put in it. So they have their own story to tell. So we need to be thinking that that is something we want to encourage, because I noticed there you had things like on that poll, work integrated learning. So that we want them all to be individuals and understand strengths and weaknesses and things that they're good at doing. So that also includes then authentic pedagogies and assessment. So we don't want everyone to be the same. We want them to have their own experience, and we want them to be able to express that through an ePortfolio. It's also a social pedagogy, so co-construction. So there's a lot of literature around that, but basically it means in a context with other people. So that could be you as the teacher with them, so that interaction, but you might also include peers. So other students might be involved as well. And that's an essential part of developing in ePortfolios. Number 4, you're probably familiar with constructive alignment. So that's John Biggs's work around basically the triangle shape that says learning activities, learning outcomes, activities and assessment should all align. So they should be all heading for the same purpose. So students understand how it all fits together. And then there's a couple more added by Joyce et al. And I've got that paper for you as well. And this is a bit different, but there is a bit of controversy sometimes in institutions, and it depends what ePortfolio software or platform you're using. But students want to feel that they own their portfolio, especially the older ones, I think. So we have students at university who obviously want to keep using it or use it after they've finished, and there needs to be ways that they can actually do that. So here I'm thinking about transitions from primary school to high school, or from high school to out in the workforce or study. Who owns that ePortfolio that they've spent a lot of time creating? So you need to think about that when you're actually developing your project. And the last one is something that I think once you're in ePortfolios, you've probably experienced. It can be disruptive. So that can be technology-wise. If some systems you have at your institutional school don't fit with ePortfolios, it can be quite disruptive. Culturally, in the context of the people, the staff and students, it can be disruptive because you're doing something very different to what they're used to. And so you have to manage that kind of reaction. So I think be prepared that it could be disruptive if other people don't know about the pedagogies involved in ePortfolios, and just manage that in the sense of, don't try and dive in too deep, too quick. You will have to manage other people's expectations as well. And I think that takes us to the next section. Somebody had a question, so whoever that was, we'll keep that for the end, if that's okay, for the halfway mark, if that's okay. I saw it go through the chat. Okay, so now we've sort of set the stage for ePortfolios. Let's think about using feedback in those ePortfolios. So what is feedback, types of feedback, elements involved in feedback, and how can we get students to be more engaged with the feedback that they're given? Thanks. Okay, so this is just a couple of examples. I'm sure there's lots more definitions, but what I wanted to try and give you here was a teacher's perspective of what is feedback, and then a student. So you as the teacher, if you're being observed in taking a class, for example, someone might say feedback may involve a grade or a judgment of standard. So for your summative tasks, you're giving them some sort of judgment that they have reached a certain performance level. But often you also are giving detailed qualitative comment on the strengths and areas of development. So they're the ones that take quite a bit of time, that you're trying to create for the students, in your view, a path of where they can go. So you're spending quite a bit of time on giving feedback, maybe just a mark sometimes, but maybe other comment. From the student's point of view, what we would like this to be is a process through which learners make sense of the information. So once we've given it to them, we would like their role, I suppose, is to make sense of that. And sometimes you get consultations and different things from people asking, students asking, what was that about? We would like them to get that from various sources and to be able to use it to enhance their work or learning strategies. And at the bottom, I've just put a few types of feedback that I know about. So feed forward was introduced in one paper a while back. So feed forward is the formative one. Early in the class semester or term, you're giving students feedback that they can use to go on in that subject. And then, of course, you've got the actual feedback that you've given once they've actually performed some task. I would suggest you get peer observation and feedback, so you can use peers, other students, and then you've got the student themselves giving feedback to themselves through a reflection process. Thanks, Shari. Okay, now this is kind of fun. I hope you like these diagrams. They come from a project called feedbackforlearning.org, and if you write, well, you'll get the slides, but you can go to that site. And they give a lot of information about use of feedback from a large project that was done in Australia. But the one on the left I can identify with is the cannonball approach. So the teacher lights the cannon and shoots the feedback to the students, and it might go, ouch. So the student goes, oh, that hurt. And then they feel better because the teacher's done their job in the time available, but then it leaves the student with not much understanding or meaning making out of that. The one on the other side, the sandwich, is probably, I would suggest, ones that I have used quite a lot, where you have that, people say, oh, you've got this process where you put something nice and you put the hard-hitting bit in the middle, like this filling of the sandwich, and then you say something nice again, or you try to point them to another direction. And it's really like, an arrow shooting them, saying, I know you're going to say something nice, and then you're going to put it in the middle. So students are quite aware of doing that. So the problem with this is educators can get frustrated. We'd like to give more feedback to the students, and we know that this is not actually the most effective way. Most professional development for how to give feedback is for educators or teachers, and the students don't actually get much education on what to do with their feedback. They're just expected to know what to do with it. Usually the student goes, oh, well, that's the feedback for that, I'll move on to the next thing, and they don't actually take an active role in what they've been given. And often they don't get any opportunity for future improvement, or they don't understand how to actually use the feedback that they're given. Thanks, Shari. This is the third one, which is from the same project, and you'll see it's a spiral. So there's the student taking great strides in their learning, and they're called feedback spirals just by the look of them in that visual. But you'll see that there's impact points, those little splotches of yellow. And so they might be the assessment task, right? And they've been given feedback and they know what to do with it. So the change cycle keeps going. And this is what we would want to suggest today for the rest of the workshop, is where we're aiming. I wouldn't say we're all there, but the aim is to help the student have a more continuous engagement with feedback, and then having points where they get more feedback to add into what they've already got. And as teachers, we can actually scaffold or put in activities or little prompts or whatever to help the student learn how to be active with the feedback and what to do with it when they get there. And that's, so we've got dual roles there. Thanks, Shari. The next slide. So just hold that in your head for a minute, that we've got our role and we've got the student role. And our role is to want to increase the opportunities for students to be able to engage with their feedback. Now, I've just simplified here a diagram from Carlos 2019. We'll also give you this paper, but just to make it a bit easier in a short space of time to understand. And it's, the arrows are really pointing in a linear direction of before, during, and after feedback. Now, this could be across the context of your whole semester, term, course, whatever, but the learners in the red square there are going to come with pre-existing ideas of what feedback is because of the experiences that they've had previously. So they may not actually want feedback because they've had some bad experiences. Only some students really know how to engage with feedback because they want to achieve well. So they have some existing capacities to engage with feedback and they might be motivated, but there's a lot of students that actually are not motivated depending on what their previous engagement or non-engagement with feedback has been. And then in the blue square under it, this is your part, teaching context. So it's how the course and activities and assessment are designed. So remember, we're trying to encourage spirals, the continuation of feedback and student engagement with it. So that's going to affect how you design your projects for a start. How I'm going to encourage that feedback. It can also depend on the atmosphere, so the environment in which your course is placed. Are you encouraging students to be engaged with feedback, and what is the value for them in doing that? Why is it an important thing? So that relationship you have with them and how you express that is an important thing. And also disciplinary norms. So I'm sure you all have specialties in your teaching, and some of those might encourage feedback more than others. So they're just a little set of things to think about when you're actually designing your ePortfolio project. Now, when the student is actually in the feedback situation, so the grey bit in the middle, this is what we would like them to do, is have a level of engagement. Okay, so if they're already engaged, great, but I'm sure you'll have students that will not be engaged. So you're going to have to work at that. We want them to make sense of that feedback. So what did it mean? And Shari will also show you some lovely ways of actually being able to do that. We would like to encourage dialogue around that feedback. So instead of shooting it out like the cannon, we want to be able to spend some time or some way of actually having a dialogue and co-construction of what does this feedback mean. And then the last point is pretty important. You're going to have to manage the effect, so the emotional response students have. You know how when we might be observed in doing our teaching and someone says something and we don't like what they say, we feel, you know, emotional about that. Like, oh, well, I tried my best, or, well, what's the point of getting feedback, or they don't know what they're talking about. So there's this emotional response students get when they get feedback sometimes, and it stops them engaging with the feedback. So the behaviour attached to that might be, I don't want to see any more feedback, I'm just going to look at the mark, I don't want to learn anymore. So there is that emotional part and a behavioural response you'll have to manage. And then lastly, the extent of the feedback impact. So we're thinking now about impact of learning. We want those individual students to actually be engaged with that and improve their performance. So the idea of feedback is to improve the performance. We want to have iterative opportunities for them to engage in feedback so that they can see cumulative impact in their learning. Thanks, Shari. And this is my last slide before we have questions. And Shari's going to pick this up just after the question time. But this is what you need to see. Feedback generally, but especially in ePortfolios, there's two perspectives. There's one for you as the teacher in your design of feedback. So let's embrace feedback in the design of your assessment tasks and think about how that's going to work, maybe not only in one assessment task, but in the regime that you're using across the whole course. And then the other one is for the students. How are you going to encourage them to have capacity for feedback and to be wanting to be actively engaged? All right, now we're open for questions.
Great. Shall I go back through the chat? Have a look. There was one earlier question. How would we protect the privacy of the author, teacher, and students having this ePortfolio, considering the domains are publicly accessible, unless these ePortfolios are embedded within the online learning management system, the LMS of the schools? I might take that one, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So it is a really good question. Well, here I can use our context. The University of Queensland, our ePortfolio system, we're lucky enough that we have a centrally supported system, and it is embedded in our LMS. So it isn't publicly available. It is in fact the students' private learning space, and we don't see anything that they put in there unless they share it with us, either by submitting something for assessment purposes or by sharing a link to that portfolio. So it is locked down, which is behind our single sign-on, which is nice. In other tools, there's a lot of free tools out there, and I will show you some ePortfolios in those. I think those also can be locked down, and it's up to the student to share those and manage that access. Christine, it is a literacy, isn't it, around the ethical considerations of ePortfolios?
Yes, and sorry, I'm just typing in the chat. There's this interesting project from ABLE, which is a North American-based group that use and advocate for ePortfolios on digital ethics in ePortfolios. And part of that reason, I think, is that in their countries, they do use a lot of different systems, of which, several are just open, public kind of systems. So whereas in Australia, we tend to use commercial packages. And they've written 10 principles of digital ethics in ePortfolios and given scenarios in that. So I'll get the link while Shari's talking in a minute, and I'll put it up for you. But it is definitely a problem, partly because of the tool that you pick, and also partly because students don't know how to actually tick the privacy correct buttons. And that's something we'll definitely talk more about in the next workshop on digital ethics. There is quite a few issues about that, privacy, confidentiality, representation, data security. So we will talk more about that. But yes, it's definitely something that you do need to be mindful of and teach your students about, because it's quite complex in some ways, and they really think they know because they're on social media or whatever, but they actually don't necessarily know how to protect their own privacy or that of other people.
There is another question in here around how do you address better the emotions of students with feedback? Can you cite examples?
Can you do that? So this, there is a paper that talks about that. I think that's where we've become more aware of that. I mean, in practice, we've always known that some students don't like the feedback, but I think actively doing something about it and maybe talking, if I was doing it now, I think I'd be talking to the students about this, this conception of feedback as they have it, and say some, and give examples from our own practice, where we've been taught, not too personal, you'd have to gauge that, but there might be a situation that you can say, I have X, and when this happens, well, for example, peer review of papers or peer review of some teaching or whatever it is, we don't always get nice comments. And sometimes, people don't say things as well as they should. So yes, when we get feedback, we do have to learn, I think it's a learning process, how to deal with that, how to overcome that and say there might be something good in what these people are saying. So that's part of that self-regulation where the student has to learn, is this fair what they're actually saying, or is it really, you know, not true, or a part of it might be true, but they've really just said it too harshly because I know I can do X. So we want to teach them that critical thinking and analysis to be able to judge whether this feedback's right or not. And part of that, I think, is a conversation which may take up some of your class time, but it could, I would say it's worth it because it just comes in at special points, you know. So when you get your assessment back this time, you'll have feedback. Some of you might not like everything or understand it. And I'm really happy to talk with you about that because my intention is to actually help you in your learning. So we're training, to think differently.
And I think that's it, Christine, is preparing students for feedback. It's the work that you might need to do with your students before that feedback happens.
Yeah.
There is some research around that, around work integrated learning, specifically in the health settings with Christy Noble and Elizabeth Malloy. And I do have a practical application for this. I'm going to show you a bit later, something called the feedback journal that can help students recognize their emotions, and then they can see trends and patterns. And it takes practice with a feedback journal and with students obtaining this feedback and managing the emotions. I think it's important to tell them that it's okay to be emotional, and it takes practice to manage your emotions so that you don't drop out of that engagement, which Christine talked about.
Yeah.
Another one, I'll take one more here. How often should we ask for feedback from students?
About our teaching? Is that what that means?
Yeah, that's Michael who asked that. How often should we ask feedbacks from students?
Well, I don't, if I'm assuming that's your own feedback about the teaching, so I will use the model.
He says yes for teaching.
Okay, so we here get evaluated on formal feedback that we don't know which student have said it at the end of something, but I would tend not to leave it there. So I have used things like sticky notes. As you leave about halfway through the course, you know, I would leave sticky notes with them and say, write something that you want us to stop, start, or continue. So they might put, you know, stop, I don't know what. Start doing something else and continue doing this. And then as you go out the door, you can leave that at the doorway so I don't see who they are. And then we put it together. Now, sometimes I'll talk about something that won't help you, like the air conditioning is not working or something, but they will give you feedback around how you could engage them more or whatever. So it's useful about halfway through. And then you can just talk to the class when you've collated these sticky notes. If there's current themes that are similar across a few students, you could go, okay, that might be something I'm doing, you know, that is annoying people or stopping them learning, and you can address that. I find that quite useful. So you don't leave it right to the end of the course and then find out, you know, something was quite disturbing for someone. So that's one way you can do it.
Okay, great. I might keep going.
Yeah, we've got another question time, so.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so keep going. Yeah.
Keep going, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be talking about now some practical applications. And so firstly, I thought I would start with some benefits of ePortfolios to help us answer that question of like, why would I adopt one into my teaching learning context? Well, ePortfolios support the integration of learning. So often we teach and assess in silos, in single subjects with single points of assessment. And I know we can be guilty of that in higher education as well. But with ePortfolios, because they can sit programmatically, we have this virtual space for students where they can make connections between these different courses. Competency standards like professional competencies for healthcare, for example, graduate attributes, and employability outcomes. And so that diagram is meant to show that ePortfolio acts as this vessel, an all-in-one solution where we can integrate all types of learning outcomes into the one place. So that's in higher education. So, but if we think about that in the school context, this is taken from the 3 dimensions of the Australian curriculum. So here we can also have integration of learning because an ePortfolio can track growth and development throughout a program across many dimensions. So here we might have the key learning areas with math, science, and arts. But in the ePortfolio, we can also link in the learning across a set of general capabilities or cross-curriculum priorities. The ePortfolio can help students transfer their learning into the developments of these literacies and skills that they're going to need beyond the classroom. That's the ePortfolio there. Another benefit of ePortfolios, which Christine spoke about as well, is being able to support the students' development and who they are and who they are becoming. So in 2020, Ajawi and her colleagues wrote about assessment as portrayal, where students construct this digital representation of their personal and professional selves, such as an ePortfolio. And us as educators, we're often looking to create more authentic assessment tasks, that have real life value for students and prepare them for the future. But Ajawi argues that for assessments to be considered authentic, assessment processes should engage the whole person to integrate what students know, how they act, and how they are. So incorporating an ePortfolio showcase into the curriculum provides students with this opportunity to create their authentic representation of their self-identity. They put together their achievements and their evidence of learning that they curated and reflected upon about why they're important in their learning journey. So here's an example that I've taken that's publicly available. The student has chosen to make this publicly available. And they've used a free tool out there called Wix. And there's quite a few examples out there, and they can use them to market themselves, like Christine said, for part-time jobs and after graduation. So there's lots of them out there if you wanted to have a look. And back to why we're here as well, another benefit is to promote this feedback for learning. So we can talk about that as well. So first of all, the timing of feedback is important with regards to students being able to actually do something with it. So rather than receiving feedback at the end of the task or end of semester, moving it forwards increases the chance that they can use that feedback to improve their learning. So remember, Christine introduced the threshold concepts. It's through that social constructivism model where students have that agency to take action on their feedback based on their co-construction of knowledge within their learning context. But it's our job to proactively design and scaffold these activities for students. So that's what we have to do as educators. But it's great because portfolios facilitate design of multi-stage assessment tasks or task series, which promote that self-regulation of learning through drafting, redrafting, reworking, and the uptake of feedback. And I've seen that a lot in the designs and see how they go when we implement ePortfolios here at UQ. And so using ePortfolios, we can regularly check in with students regularly to see how they're going. So here's an example. So perhaps you might have a series of lab reports or a series of reflective tasks that the students do. And after each task, then there is a feedback cycle. Or perhaps you could do a group project, some group work, something collaborative, and then the students present in front of their peers for feedback, and then maybe they submit a final report, maybe individually. Or students could do a YouTube clip, something that a lot of students love to do that, on a skill or a process, showing how to do a recipe. Maybe it's make slime or fold some origami, and then taking that video and giving it to a peer who uses that video to perform that skill. And there's an observation of how it goes. And based on that observation, perhaps that they construct an action plan, a written action plan on how they need to improve that clip for it to be more effective. So you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, this is a lot of feedback that I have to engage in here. Well, you're not the only source of feedback. Here in these examples, students are producing their own feedback and there's peer feedbacks. And it's interesting because ePortfolios give students the opportunity to curate this feedback where they give, receive, and work with it from multiple sources. It's more sustainable. It doesn't all need to come from you. So I'm going to show you an example next of a task series that's here in use at the university. This is a master pharmaceutical industry practice. It's in a couple of courses where the students are out on these lengthy placements for a few months at a time. And they have a series of reflective tasks that they have to complete. And those reflective tasks are are on topic according to where they should be in that learning in the workplace. And we give the students a reflective framework. Here at UQ, we call it the SEAL reflection framework. It's situation, effect, action, learning. And the situation, effect, action is written on the ePortfolio page, but the learning is a video where the student describes what they learned and what they would do next time when they encountered a similar situation. And in the ePortfolio, they can review their previous reflections. And what we've seen here is a development of personhood. Again, who are they becoming as they align their professional identity with the workplace? So it's really interesting. We also have some self-assessment in this program. Here in the mid-performance evaluation, the students perform a self-evaluation of how they think they're performing up to date. And then that gives them a chance to activate their role. So they have something to talk about with their supervisors rather than passively receiving that feedback. And also afterwards, we have a feedback action plan. Is it even feedback if students don't take action with it? So here's where students review their feedback and they describe and evaluate how they will take action with it to improve their performance. So that's one example of a task series. Oh, and feedback spirals. Again, it's about creating these feedback spirals where students can use the feedback on their reflections and incorporating into the next ones. And the instructors find, the teachers find, they give quite a bit of reflection or feedback up here in the beginning, but towards the end, students have really got the hang of it. And so they understand what they need to do. So how do I do this? So how do we get to that point? Well, this is about some questions in order for the academics when I meet with them to understand those threshold concepts. So what is the purpose of ePortfolio? What do you want to achieve? What are students going to demonstrate that they're meeting and achieving their learning outcomes? What are the tasks which will enable students to demonstrate their learning process? How do you think that what can we put in there? What will students do to demonstrate? And then this constructive alignment, which course learning outcomes, capabilities, program priorities, employability skills do they align to? When do the tasks occur? And because that leads me into constructing some feedback spirals. And then often I say, well, how will you engage students in the feedback process? And often academics aren't quite sure, haven't really thought about that just yet. And that's okay, because it's my job to help reposition students as active participants in that feedback process. So here's some examples of small things and how we can do that. So for students to be active participants, the students and teachers need to come together understanding what it takes. We'll need to explain the new roles to the students, as we as educators need to oversee that whole process. So students need to understand the importance of feedback. They need to value having a role, being active in it. They need to learn to self-evaluate and compare feedback from various sources. And they have to be aware of their role to action feedback. They have to do something with it. As educators, we have to design assessments to enable students to make judgments, the quality of their work, and use feedback. And we have to guide students in composing and receiving peer feedback. And so we're going to look at that a little bit further. So starting with the self-assessment. So often students hand in an assignment and think, phew, that's over. But what if we give them a chance to provide their own feedback? Involving your students to make judgment about the quality of their own work, it's more sustainable than you providing all of that feedback. And it's important to expose students to self-assessment so they come to expect it as a part of the learning process. And the ePortfolio is really a perfect place to do this. We also know that lifelong learning requires self-assessment skills. So here's an example taken from within a portfolio. Again, this is a student who is meeting with a supervisor out on placement. And they essentially assess themselves and they provide a justification for that level chosen. And again, it puts them in that active role rather than meeting with their supervisor and having nothing to say. And it's about creating that dialogic space for them to discuss improving performance and learning outcomes. Peer feedback. We're just going to touch on this. There is a huge body of research out there around peer feedback, which Christine and I can share with you. But students producing feedback meetings for themselves, again, reduces that need for teacher feedback. In this particular study by Nicole Thompson and Breslin, in an engineering class, students produced a draft. So initially students have to produce something, and then they provided the feedback on the drafts of 2 peers, and they received the comments from 2 peers, and then they had the opportunity to update their work. So interestingly, in this study, the students reported 2 very different things happening from giving feedback and receiving feedback. So giving feedback is more cognitively engaging. This is where they apply the assessment criteria. Looking at the work of their peers provides insights or approaches or something that they hadn't considered. Versus receiving feedback. Receiving feedback is really about information, about how others interpret their work, and provide specific areas where they might want to improve. So giving feedback gives them the chance to take that assessor's or that teacher's position, and but they always anchor it back to their own work. It's important that we provide opportunities for them to do that by enabling them to update that work based on that process. So that's peer feedback. Feedback journals. So this came up around managing the emotional affects of feedback. So a feedback journal and a portfolio can sit, again, program-wide across many courses, and it can track instances and plans for improvement. It's a place for students to deconstruct the feedback that they've been receiving and for them to identify strengths or areas of priorities for their development. This particular one with the prompts can help them to track their emotional responses to feedback over time, and reinforces some key features of effective feedback, which is dialogue and plan for improvement. So in this example, adapted from Noble et al., and we'll share this paper with you, who was involved in the feedback? What was the activity? Outline why you think the feedback was good or poor. It's interesting to get students' point of view on what they need. What do they need to help their development? How did it make you feel? And you see the students can be brutally honest about how they felt with this feedback. But again, if they over time are producing these feedback journals, they'll start to track those emotional responses, and with practice, they'll deal with them a little bit better. Which questions could you ask your teacher, and what's your plan for improving? So that's the feedback journal. Feedback cover sheet. This is probably my most favorite initiative, and I design these in almost every ePortfolio design that I do. So this accompanies an assessment or an activity that a student is submitting for feedback from you, and they ask some questions. They answer some questions in the cover sheet. So it promotes, again, this participation, their role in the feedback process. And so some sample questions you could ask them: how have you incorporated learning feedback from the previous assignment or assessment into this one, if that's applicable and it's a task series? What do you think is the strongest part of your assignment? Which area of your assignment are you unsure of, or did you find most challenging? And that also helps to inform you as a teacher. If students are all saying, hey, we're really struggling with this, then that helps you know that you perhaps could incorporate more coverage across that concept. And then I always get them to say, I would particularly like feedback on, get them to list some areas. So again, that's them reflecting and doing a bit of evaluative judgment of the quality of their own work, and asking you for specific feedback where you needed the most, where they needed the most. Action plan. So here's an example of what that action plan could look like with the prompts. So this is following any assignment where that feedback was provided. Again, helping with that uptake. It can help shifting focus from the grade. In fact, you could leave the grade altogether and just make it about that feedback. And also can help clarify any feedback that they didn't understand. So as an example prompts, review your feedback. Did any of the scores or feedback surprise you, and why? What are 3 plans of action you will take to implement this feedback? And have you received any feedback which you didn't understand, and which feedback? Oh, and next poll. So here, based on everything we just talked about, I'm going to launch this next poll. So I went through a lot really quickly here, but here's your poll. which initiatives would you consider applying to your teaching? So we've looked at creating feedback spirals through multi-stage assessments or the design of tasks. What about some self-assessment, peer feedback, like a peer review, perhaps a feedback journal. Feedback journals are excellent as well for students who perhaps aren't engaging in feedback on a regular basis, don't want to have that feedback. Maybe this is their special place that they can go in and they can reflect on that and record these instances of feedback, feedback cover sheet, and feedback action plans. We're coming into a question time again. I can see there's some questions in the chat, so we're almost there. I think you can select more than one here. So maybe there's a couple that you'd really like to incorporate into your teaching. Just 10 more seconds and then I'll close that poll. Christine, did you vote as well? Okay, I'm gonna end that poll. And I'll share the results with you. Okay, so hopefully you can see those. So the winner is self-assessment. So that's great to see that. But I see feedback, well, the rest of them were big hits as well. Feedback action plans sneaking up there as well, and tied with peer feedback, with peer review, which is good to see that as well. Often I have the peer review or peer feedback occur outside of the portfolio, but the reflection and the uptake and the learning from that peer feedback happens inside the portfolio. There's some excellent research around David Nicol and exploiting students' natural comparison processes using peer feedback and peer review. So that's something that Christine and I can share with you. Okay. So let's open that up for questions.
So Shari, there's one question from Ray, and we come across this too, is what do you do, and actually, sorry, Lisa as well, about these passive students who don't want to submit feedback, what would you do? And Ray mentions, you know, that they have to grade it something so the students would actually do it, which we are familiar with at UQ. Why do a formative task when, you know, it's not worth any of my marks?
You could, in the later tasks, reserve a portion of the grade for those formative, for the drafts, and engaging in that feedback. So I have seen academics do that, where they reserve perhaps that final criteria. If you use rubrics, that final criteria is around participating in the drafts and around that feedback, or maybe it's around uptaking that feedback, how they worked with the feedback from the drafts. I've heard some academics say that they won't mark and won't provide any feedback on the final version unless they do submit a draft or participate in the feedback process. So I know that can be difficult. And I mean, we can't force students to participate in it. It's not for everybody. Everybody's coming from a different place. It's not going to suit everybody. But through practice, hopefully they come to expect it. I don't know, Christine, what do you think?
I think it is a challenge with the strategic type of students that we get. Plus, we have a lot of high achieving students who concentrate on getting the marks. So it is a challenge, but I think ePortfolios in itself breaks that down a bit because, you know, you can feed things in there, which may lead, like you say, maybe not a draft, but something that leads to assessment tasks. But if you really have a problem with that, I think you're right. I think you need to add some proportion of it somewhere for a cumulative amount, because those students that do things for marks tend to do that. So even if it was only a small amount, hopefully by the time they actually get further on, they've actually learned that formative things would actually help them. So it's not an easy one. We would like them to all think that it's worth it, but some of them don't think so. So I guess we have to try and change their opinions and the way of doing things. And that could be over a period of time, or maybe later when they get to work and find out you still have to do things and there's no marks.
Yeah, it is interesting how it is a culturally related concern. I totally agree. Repositioning students as these active participants in the role is a new paradigm of feedback. And if you're the innovative teacher and you're the first one to do this, yeah, it's a lot of work and it's changing their minds. And again, all those things that we broke down around your role in that and the student's role in that, those all have to come together for this to work. But you doing that, then the students, hopefully as the students progress, the next teachers they encounter also have this same ideological view on feedbacks and how we're going to reposition them as well. Anything else, Christine? What else did you see?
No, but I was just going to say something else. There's a bit of comment there, but I was just going to say something else about that. So with your project, it's one great thing to actually have a project for students to use an ePortfolio, but the ideal would really be that you engage with other teachers, maybe in the grades below or above or across, subjects in the older children, that they could encourage the students to use ePortfolios or to put something into an ePortfolio. So you're just not getting the students to learn a technology for the sake of it, just for a little bit. You just need to be mindful that it will take them, and someone commented on this, the technology does take students a while to learn. So whether you're going to actually give them some marks for learning the technology, but it does help to have other colleagues involved to support the idea that doing an ePortfolio is an effective tool for the students and there's value in them doing it.
Yeah, that's so often one of the difficulties. It is the technology sometimes, but not so much the technology or the educational design. It's the procedural structures within, it's the structures that we tend to teach in silos, and it's about getting everybody on board and extending the learning and the processes, the ePortfolio past your individual context. I think that's the most difficult. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, some good comments. Technology serves as a medium to allow our students to express themselves and part of that feedback mechanism. Absolutely.
One more minute.
Yeah, give you another minute.
What strategies do you employ to encourage students to express their ideas?
I suppose trying to implement a community of learning and saying that you're all learning together, and you could I think that's where formative assessment comes into play as well, where not everything they do is worth grades. It's for formative, it's for feedback. You're learning together. I see that through our LMS, us creating this, we're coming together in this one space and getting students to be more open and speaking up and sharing their ideas. And I think the portfolio does that as well, because there's often no wrong answer, because it is the students' agency to be able to go in and create their own, make it their personal learning space and take a strengths-based approach to this. Where we're celebrating who they are as students and their distinctiveness. It's such a assessment of learning, isn't it? Where we're enabling them to express themselves. And I don't know how else to other than explain that it's, if you come together and that it's about the learning, that there's no right or wrong answers in the beginning. The ePortfolio is also interesting because rather than the students submitting something at the end, you can have them share a link to their ePortfolio at the beginning, again, which is different. And then you're able to then touch base with them regularly and keep track of their development and nudge them along and put in place remediation strategies. along the way, rather than finding it at the end that they've been completely disengaged. You're able to, again, help them keep track and keep pace with the course. So it's another way.
We've had one comment saying they use Jamboarding within Google Classroom, so to have students interact. And I guess part of that is making it fun and some topics that are familiar to them, so they can feel that they can say something, maybe team, small group, setting different activities that will appeal before you get maybe to the more intense type of things you have to do in it. You know, when you're learning the technology, make it some fun for them to actually do that. So we've had a question from Anne about challenges of using ePortfolios as assessment, and you mean for teachers. So we may comment briefly here, but we are going to do another workshop on assessment. So it'd be interesting to know what sort of challenges for the teacher you're actually talking about. Are you talking about workload or?
Yeah, it could be workload. I think establishing the pedagogical strategy, firstly, is the purpose. Why are you doing this, and how are you going to do it? How are students going to demonstrate meaningful learning? And then the technology, really learning. You have to learn the technology, and you have to teach your students to also learn that technology.
Yeah.
And if you don't have support to do that, then that might be on you to manage all of that, which is big. What were you going to say, Christine?
I was just going to say, I don't know that it's fair. I'm just assuming that it's one piece of assessment, unless it had stages adding up to it. I don't think it's fair to ask students to actually use an ePortfolio for that. I think you need to arrange a whole series of assessment or activities at least, because it's going to be a learning curve for them to know how to use it. And sometimes we forget in the, you know, we emphasize pedagogy, which is fine, but we mustn't forget that it does take a learning experience and a learning effort for the students to learn the technology. And so therefore, maybe we, right, so you were talking about group work making a company website. Yes, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it. I mean, it sounds like a great final assessment, but if you don't have the skills on how to make a website, that could be challenging. So that might be, maybe we'll leave that one over and Ray says that he actually does that, but maybe we'll talk a bit more about that on using, you know, assessment in ePortfolios, because it is a good question. How much do you mark the students for an assessment? How much scaffolding? How much do you give them a mark for using the technology or whatever? And I think that's a good discussion to have around a sustainable use of ePortfolios for assessment. So Anne, when you're there, bring that up again, because I can see we can just, if we forget for some reason, you bring it back up. I don't think we will, but you know, that's a good question. All right, well, our workload, yep, okay. It is a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, and this could be in addition to that around, you know, again, around the strategy and the technology. And
yes, so now can you suggest that we talk about that in the assessment one, or perhaps the professional development one, because workload generally is a problem for teachers. But there are ways that I think you need to consider. One of the, for example, is maybe the assessment one now, because one of the principles of assessment at UQ is that it should be a sustainable workload. And I know that's whatever that means, but it is a consideration when we're designing how to use ePortfolios for assessment plus other things. You know, what's manageable for us and what's manageable for the students.
yeah, and so often we do hear that, I just don't have time for this, time to make changes. It's so much quicker just to have an exam. Yes,
which we're not always encouraging because of pedagogical reasons. Yeah, but it's I think it's something that needs to be discussed. You know, everyone's feeling it. No matter where you are, I think we feel the workload, and it's a good thing to discuss and to give ourselves permission that there needs to be considerations of how much is enough. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Okay, we might head over to Nan now. Did you want to conclude?
We're going to have the another one, or we have.
Yeah, you're happy to have another question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. So are we going to have another session? I mean, I thought that we have 3 sessions.
Oh no, there was 2 in the first bit. Yeah.
Okay.
No, we planned for an hour and a half. So.
All right.
Sorry.
Yes. So I'm sorry. I might miss it. So thank you very much. This is very insightful and incredible session. And then yes, I really like the ideas that we give the student like iterative feedback throughout the learning. So yes, and actually the courses that we are teaching, we actually we tell the student at the beginning, because last week is the first week of teaching, so we tell them that we will give them the feedback, and then they need to act on the feedback and then use the feedback in the later assessment. Yeah. So my question is will be like how are we going to do you have like some tools that help the student act on the feedback or give the feedback? For example, the PI assessment feedback. What kind of tools that we can help them to give the constructive feedback, as well as to learn from the feedback that they give to the peer?
Do you want to answer that, Shari?
So we're talking about resources on what makes good peer feedback, or are we talking about the tool in which to facilitate that feedback? Which one?
Yeah, the feedback that like help the student to give effective.
Yes, like instructions on how to give feedback,
and then know that they give the good feedback as well.
Yeah. Well, students, and so there is research around that, around constructing some questions for the students and what you should include in that. And so often those students are not going to give really good feedback. It's really the learning that occurs in that peer feedback process is through the internal feedback that they produce. So when you are, we do this as well. When we read somebody else's paper or look at their lesson plans and we review our peers' work, we're creating our own feedback. We are creating our internal feedback as we reflect, hey, I didn't think about that. I should do that. Oh, I didn't think about that. That I'm going to include it as well. That's where that learning comes in. Even if I then give you some feedback, even if I use a sandwich and say, here's something really good, here's something you need to work on, here's something really good again. The learning process is from the internal feedback as I anchor that back to my own work, how I'm going to improve my own work. So that's really it. But in terms of how to structure that, I think we would have to get some resources together to see how to incorporate that into your own setting. I see Christine's just put it into the chat.
Oh no, that was something else. I'm answering questions. I'm doing 2 things. But I think I have been in the situation where we've actually had 3 people in groups. So it depends, I suppose, if you're face-to-face or online, it's a bit different. But in this one, there was an observer. So I think, one, you do need to set up, like you've got your rubric for whatever or your marking criteria for the assessment. So if they're giving peer feedback or peer assessment on a draft, say, they should only be talking constructively around what's on that rubric or using that as their reference. So you need to give them instruction on how to do that. And I think you also need to say, you maybe be respectful to each other. You don't like getting bad feedback. Yeah. So I guess the rules around that. And then we also had observers. So that was like a bit of a safety mechanism that if someone really went off, they could say, hey, I don't think that's probably, right or something. So there was a person in there that sort of measured it. But you definitely have to give them a set of instructions because they don't know. Currently so the benefit for them is actually, like Shari said, they give feedback. It may not be very good, but what they learn of how, about their own work and reflection is the thing. And maybe you just need to give them the rules about respect and using some sort of tool that they have to give the feedback by. And if they're going to give, you know, negative feedback, there needs to be some discussion around constructive feedback and what that means.
Yeah.
You know, you don't go, oh, that was terrible what you wrote. You know, how would
Yeah.
you like that if I wrote that or not? You know, so in another way, you're also teaching them about how to deal with the affective feedback, you know, that affect the emotional of it. So it's another teaching moment for them. But I wouldn't give a big grade for that, like, you know, a high percentage for them doing it.
Yeah, and nor are they grading their students' work, right? They're not providing a grade. So often if you've got a rubric and you've got criteria, we'll create questions out of that rubric. So some simple questions that the students can address in looking at their peers' work. So, you know, based on that criteria, you might say, does your peers' work contain the following things? You know, it's just something to help them structure what they're looking at and the feedback they're going to provide, but keep it really simple. You know, even if it's just a couple things that they're going to answer based on their peers' work. You don't have to give them this huge rubric with really detailed criteria descriptors. You know, they're not going to be able to manage that. Just simple things that they can look over and tick off on their peers' work. Again, not for grades, it's for qualitative feedback only.
Yes. Yes, I like the idea that make the language their language, so they
Yes,
understand.
yes. And you know what you could do is you could construct that with them. You could construct the criteria that they're looking for their peers at their peers' work. Do that with them. Again, that's really involving the students in the assessment process as well. So you could do that. What would good work look like? Let's come up with some questions that we can together then evaluate our peers' work.
And probably do more than one evaluation. Give them 2 or 3 to do. So that measures it out a bit. And I guess the bottom line is speak to the people like you would like them to speak to you about your work. But make it, I think it's always a bit contentious.
The research shows that, Christine said, multiple sequential comparisons improves the learning process. So rather than just looking at one peer's work, again, if you look at 2 or 3, if you can facilitate that, that makes a likelihood that they might see, you know, a student that struggles with this concept and a student that did an amazing job, and that helps inform, again, how to improve their learning on that. So a few different instances improves that feedback process.
Yes. I just would like to inform the members that I post the attendance link. So please carefully enter the information, because this information will appear in your certificate as well as the survey. And we would like to use your opinions to prepare for the next one as well. And on of the resources that Christine and Shari will share with me, I'm going to share with within our community website. And basically, I think I will post in the webinar page. So everything will be there, including the recording as well as the literature that related to that. I'm not sure if you're going to share with us the PowerPoint.
Yes, absolutely. Slides and resources. I didn't share. I had a slide on all the different references, but we'll put together PDFs of the PowerPoint and all the resources that we quoted today, so you can all have a read of that.
Thank you so much. This is very wonderful session, and I know that we learn a lot from my personal experience. Can we please give Shari and Christine a big applause to show our appreciation for their generous.
Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you all again in the upcoming webinars. 3 more to go. We'll get to know each other.
Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Shari, Christine, thank you very much.
Thank you, Fillmore.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.